I did some thinking on accelerationism due to the current events. AI, billionaires, scary cyber demons, or whatever. I think it's fair to say if anyone's an optimist in 2026, they haven't been paying attention, or maybe they're just naive. Speaking of naive, I imagine someone's going to point out how my so-called solutions later in the video appear naive. So I'll just say that right off the bat that while there aren't permanent solutions, there are better circumstances. And while much of it might be unattainable right now, if humanity doesn't burn this planet to the ground, we're going to have to make some changes at some point, and it just becomes a matter of time. I would say radical change within 200 years. But if you ask me whether I think I can figure out societal problems, I can't. I don't think anyone can. Also, when I'm talking about accelerationism, I'm speaking generally. I don't mean racial acceleration. This has little to do with culture wars. If all 8 billion people woke up tomorrow as black or white or Asian or anything else, it's irrelevant to the big picture. I'm talking about general politics, also facing the oligarchs, technology, privacy, societal collapse, and so on. The question is whether or not things have to get worse before they get better. If so, why not just get there quicker? As a pessimist, it's a good question. If I have no faith in humanity, do we stoke the flames? Maybe not. So this video is going to be very political, and one I won't do very often. Probably not again, to be honest. Politics are far less interesting than other topics. I've still got plenty dark and philosophical videos on their way, so in a way this video needs to act as a foundation for certain future essays. Here's my thoughts on how society should attempt to move forward, as well as some predictions. There's been a surge of Eastern culture struggling. We can turn our eyes to China to see the letting it rot memes, for example. Young people are rejecting full-time jobs, marriage, love, ambitions altogether. People are beginning to realize slavery was never abolished. It's more like it became more carefully concealed. They have the freedom to live in a tiny, deteriorating apartment, but still slaves. It's a strange sight to witness modern technology and human obsolescence. Like, robots are ready to handle business for humanity. Instead, people have been relegated to the labor while machines are busy producing art and music. So how did we get so backwards? I'd like you to consider whether or not this is intentional, or further yet, is this actually backwards, or is it natural progression? Even though people are having fewer children, we're still slowly growing in global population, and we have to wonder at what point will we break. South Korea, Taiwan, Japan, but westward we still have countries like Italy, Spain, Albania, Ukraine, even the largest countries like the United States, China, Brazil. They're all facing a massive shift. The replacement levels continue to drop. So at what point does a society intervene when the top percentage control the world? Or is it more than economics? Is this a great moral awakening to the true state of the world? Perhaps it has to do more with politics. About 94% of Americans, for example, are dissatisfied with how many files were released so far. The president promised full transparency for the Epstein files, and, well, the United States went to war with Iran instead. The best way to sweep a problem under the rug is to spill another mess over it. We continue to see excuses, redactions, we see zero accountability, and this is a complete bipartisan issue. If the world isn't evil, then what is it? And we have to ask ourselves, is that the natural hierarchy of intelligence? To steal, to lie, to violate others. I mean, are these really the primary qualities for the best of us? Because when you think about it, it takes a ruthless person to climb to the top. So, is there some kind of political solution? Is this just the result of unfettered capitalism? Is it possible for more socialist policies, for example, to seize the stage and handle it differently? Now, we could assert that Donald Trump makes an excellent example of accelerationism. Is he not doing exactly this? Are we not currently in the process of destroying our planet? By this principle, we could pursue the breaking of the wheel, as it were, by spinning it too fast. So how bad does it have to get? And how do we know when things get bad enough to break? It seems like as long as you overwork people and give them a little bit of ice cream on top, they'll continue to tolerate the status quo. Because you can claim it can always be worse. So, do we let AI take people's jobs? Do we spam AI-generated content and bloat the data centers throughout the world? Perhaps there is some end goal in sight, or at least some higher ground in which we can move more rapidly. Can this reasonably be done? There's no sign of a meteor striking Earth anytime soon, so do we completely give up on climate control? Or does accelerationism presume that we'll have to settle matters with outright violence? If people truly believe they live in absolute corruption, why do they comply? Ultimately, we're running on hope and fear. The optimists, if their effort is to genuinely build a better world, lack the conviction for aggressive change. But the pessimists have little reason to act in the advent of a failing society. This would be entirely selfish, of course. When the oligarchs come knocking at our own door, then we'll certainly do what we can to stave them off. Whether it's for us or another generation, we can only care about the immediacy of suffering. So, should we extend this principle to the average person? Of course, we have to. The key problem is that accelerationism, in all of its grotesquerie, doesn't promise the end of the world. If it backfires, it doesn't necessarily break the cycle, where one billionaire loses control, several more take their place. A corporate nightmare is unlikely to build the singularity. You shouldn't be worried about the tools, you should just be worried about who they belong to. Now, there is a chance that one of these rich elites accidentally blows up the planet, and all it takes is one. By odds alone, one of these rich assholes is sure to doom us permanently in the coming centuries. But realistically, humanity won't disappear in one fell swoop. Also, if that's the case, we should consider resisting that if other life on Earth remains, as it simply resets the button for evolution. The sun isn't dying anytime soon, and life finds a way. Suffering is late-stage evolution, and time is not an issue. Now, it's unlikely that AI will either save or destroy us. The Industrial Revolution killed God in the 19th century, but here we are, chugging along, building towards something. This something is no more than the hoarding of resources, tools built for better tools, efficiency granting more expenditure, more waste. But if we suppose the socialists seize the means of production, they topple the structure of capitalism, and the power swings in their direction, can we imagine a world where the pessimist, the naysayer, the doomer, maybe the misanthrope can live comfortably? Or is such a utopia an attack on personal liberties? There's also an unsettling apprehension for the skeptical pessimist who has already read the history books. In relatively recent times, we can look to figures like Edward von Hartmann or Philip Mainlander, where Hartmann pushes a more conservative, elitist-based hierarchy towards an inescapable eschatology. Mainlander advocates for a socialist, perhaps communist-based utopia. And only through this utopia will people come to terms with the futility of existence. But if he's wrong, then isn't he creating a better society anyway? So, if someone living the worst life on Earth forces everyone else to see through their eyes long enough so that humanity would end this failed experiment, if that's the case, could someone living the best possible life allow others to see through their eyes long enough so humanity can affirm some utopia? In any case, the three problems remain with humanity that they will consistently face, that is, aging, suffering, and death. Let's talk about the individual now. While quietism isn't diametrically opposed to accelerationism, it would certainly be difficult to play well for both sides effectively. Where someone like Goethe remains a quietist, someone like Fichte is fired up. If someone gets that reference, by the way, you're actually a genius, and if you don't get it, well, I think someone eventually will. Anyway, the philosophy of quietism burgeoned through the so-called Christian heretics in the 17th century, with Miguel de Molinos leading the charge. Of course, this wasn't the most novel idea in history. The idea of detachment, asceticism, inner contemplation, and surrendering to a higher power was one of many philosophical teachings throughout history. Buddhism especially comes to mind. On a side note, it is interesting that Molinos himself sounds a lot like later pessimists previously mentioned. For example, in his book, The Spiritual Guide, he preaches the virtues of silence, passivity, abandonment to God, and even self-annihilation, though perhaps this is more of a spiritual kind. That does sound rather familiar. We need not look further than the ancient Greeks with respect to the virtues of mindfulness and soul-searching. And of course, we would see the fusion of Western metaphysics and Eastern spirituality through notable writers like Schopenhauer. Quietism in this manner is about renunciation to the will. It's an attempt to shrug off struggling and desiring. Quietism, in some ways, is the act of hiking around in nature. However, though some may attempt this communion with the world at large, I also consider the contradictions of these efforts. For example, Nietzsche criticizes the obvious paradox in which one attempts to live in accordance with nature. In his book, Beyond Good and Evil, he considers this a farce. Nature doesn't want, it just is. It's an indifferent force lacking justice and pity, and yet, ironically, philosophers throughout history want to live harmoniously when clearly they're attempting to live vivaciously. Such a thing only exists in men. Nature is brutal, and we scorn such behavior as immoral. People are, of course, walking contradictions. So, quietism is more about a quiet resistance. In this way, we are closer to killing God than we are to serving Him. Once again, acceleration appears to gain merit here if we take our resistance against nature up to full throttle. Still, quietism in a world charged with technology at full speed ahead, what does it prevent? It's still not good enough to stand and stare, whether or not we find ourselves in direct collision. This assumes we have some control over the accelerationists. And yes, I believe we do. That's why philosophically I lean towards virtue ethics and the value of inner contemplation, but society still has to function. Since quietism is more of a passive renunciation, and I believe in active participation where it's helpful, I shift a bit. The perspective is what I like to call attenuationism. Attenuating just means to weaken or diminish society as a whole. In fact, we purposely aim for fragmentation with condensed communities instead of overall shrinkage. In a weird way, it's a bit like accelerationism and quietism, though it does lean much more towards the latter. The general truth about politics is that most people are more communist in fewer numbers with tighter bonds. But across a vast web of billions of people, it's practically impossible to care for people we'll never meet, and, our individual liberties cry for attention. Almost everyone is a leftist in a small community, more so in their own family, and the general attitude shifts towards selfishness with respect to distance, kinship, and population. To care about someone requires closeness. Of course, we would be want without mentioning Peter Singer's problem of evil when considering propinquity and ethical responsibilities. The obvious counterargument is that all living things seek to reproduce and nature itself seeks to grow where opportunities arise. But again, is humanity not the sole proprietor to rebelling against that? Furthermore, reducing the population is just a matter of time if our current way of life is unsustainable, which it is. So the question is whether we wait until people are forced to starve, or do we incentivize people to have fewer children? And this is, of course, where a certain threshold has to be met, because there has to be enough people to manage the planet as well as control our own population. Still, there's room to fluctuate so long as humanity doesn't go extinct. So attenuationism isn't a substitute for quietism, but more of an active stimulant. It's aggressive support. It's about reducing population, minimizing power, and distribution. But it's also about wildlife control, not just ascetic human behavior. We would have to encourage scientific advancement and technological growth. Considering the current political climate, it obviously has its own problems. Still, I'm wary of an anarcho-communist utopia, even socialist revolutions. In theory, and this is just political theory, I'm a classic liberal, but of course someone like Bobby Kennedy identifies as such, so I think the idea of a classic liberal has long since expired and mutated into something far more horrifying. In practice, I'm a social democrat. The late-stage capitalist experiment has been attempted and with no success, unless we consider this a success. But again, I'm wary of a communist takeover. Anyone who's ever worked a minimum wage job and has had to pick up the slack for lazy workers, or anyone who's ever had a roommate who doesn't pull their weight, or anyone who is expected to contribute more simply because they were healthier or more capable, all of those people recoil in horror at the idea of giving up personal freedom, just to help someone who is able but unwilling. So I don't mean those with disabilities, but people have to generally be burden-free to reach their most realistic potential. Of course, this is also selfish on some level, but I believe personal merit requires precedence. Any of you who have had enough experiences where you consistently get the short straw will understand, especially when drawing the short straw wasn't an accident. But earning billions of dollars isn't reaching a realistic potential. It's just squandering, hoarding, and exploiting everyone around you. But completely eliminating capital and moderate privacy is also delusional. Unfortunately, a major problem, one which is rarely spoken of because of its inherent controversy, is overpopulation. So, with attenuationism, few steps are actually required, none of which would actually violate anybody's consent. As stated earlier, our replacement level is already diminishing. However, the animals would be another question, mostly factory farming, of course, but even that would naturally decline if humanity shrinks in size. Simply put, people aren't destroying nature. We are nature. Nature is destroying itself. In this respect, we would have to keep it contained. Nevertheless, let's imagine an anarcho-communist world. We'll use a fictional example. We can still imagine the implications, of course. I recently read Ursula K. Le Guin's The Dispossessed, where she explores a post-capitalist anarchy culture. It's not the most action-packed book, but there's lots of ideas explored about a post-capitalist society. I'd recommend it if you're interested in sort of a slow-paced old-school read. You might have heard of her name before, Ursula K. Le Guin, but if you haven't, there's another particular short story you should read, The Ones Who Walk Away from the Omelas. If you only had time to read one short story in your entire life, actually, let it be that one. But that's a tale for another time, one that an entire video could have on its own. So, in The Dispossessed, the main character, Shevik, travels to a moon called Anaris. The anarchist Odonians who settled here abolished property and even tried to remove the concept of possession from language, including yours and mine. Anaris rejects private property, profit, and even status. Goods circulate through the public sector, and labor is distributed through syndicates. So there is power to the individual, and there's still some with prominence, but wealth isn't hoarded by one person. Attenuationism is similar in a way. Too much scale creates blind spots and unnecessary bureaucracy. Too much private wealth naturally creates a hierarchy, and unfettered expansion generally hurts local communities. The core understanding is that growth tends to debilitate ethics. The capitalist planet Eurus constantly threatens Anaris. Shevik's perspective as a physics teacher shows the seductive side of prestige and abundance. Once again, I would reject acceleration and obsessive productivity. There's also the loss of personal identity in capitalism when people eventually become commodities, or at least marketable assets. But Anaris has its own flaws, and Le Guin doesn't pretend that anarchistic society isn't without its own problems. Instead of tight-knit families, children are raised communally, and people continue to reproduce as they normally would. Their society does value science and constantly seeks improvement, quite optimistic really. But Shevik himself gets special treatment, and not in a good way. He's constantly censored from his groundbreaking research on his theory of simultaneity. He's effectively blacklisted. Why? Well, there's many reasons, and you'd have to read the book. But basically his work is indeed highly theoretical, and it doesn't really help with the manual labor. And it's difficult to side with him completely because it's a rugged, arid landscape on Anaris. So naturally you're going to piss a lot of people off when you dig around with scientific papers that don't seem to contribute to any practical solutions. Anaris is a society meant to be free of government, but the syndicates naturally form from their own unofficial powers. It's not too different than the contempt right-wingers currently hold against scientists who get grants in theoretical fields of study, especially physics. Her fictional story doesn't even feel like fiction, really. It feels like a modern retelling. So Shevik is, of course, ostracized, and he attempts to contact Eurus, home of the capitalists. He tries to take his leave, and he's treated like a rebel and a traitor. The novel makes us question, what has value in a society? Who decides the merit of intellectual growth? Because we know that all it takes is a handful of geniuses to pick up the entire race and propel them forward. And sometimes they're wrong, usually they are, but they need the space and liberty to create, whether it's art, science, or philosophy. The social pressure on Anaris seems even more effective at control than a police state, not that I prefer that either. So we can still see that in a far-left society, personal identity breaks down in another way, and the problem still rests with scale. Attenuationism is about whether creating more life is a good thing, especially when hierarchies seem to be unavoidable. Complexity should not expand. Why should we go to Mars, for example? Why? If we can't even take care of Earth, why should we despoil another planet? For what reason? Especially when you consider the human species, you have to ask whether more life equals more mercy. Suffering is more than political. It's biological, ecological, and the core component of consciousness. Without feelings, I doubt humans would need philosophy, or anything really. So there's some merit in the idea for attenuationism. If society has to fracture, or at least depopulate, we would expect smaller communities. And it would be ridiculous to assume a tiny population concentrates in one area of the world. In fact, the land and resources would encourage more sporadic beliefs, more vibrant cultures, unique perspectives where people can focus on their individuality, but they still remain in close touch with a tight community. I mentioned that, in theory, I like classic liberalism, like a John Stuart Mill type, as long as community respects individual liberties. But an important note on Mill. First of all, he was a 19th century philosopher, so times were different. But let me read you some policies he supported, and I'll show you guys why I hate labels in general. Also, keep in mind that he shifted some of his views in later years. So, he believed in the end of the traditional capitalist system. He predicted future society would need to be worker-owned with managed cooperatives, that is, minimal or no outside investors, not necessarily leftist actually, but favoring voluntary teamwork. He believed that the workers should collectively own the capital as well as electing their own managers, like a union. He also fought for women's rights, like voting and education, and he spurned the idea of unearned land value. In other words, landlord bastards who profit simply from population growth and the development around them. Once again, attenuationism naturally aligns here. As far as wealth inequality, Mill advocated towards a limit for inheritance. No one should inherit a fortune without working for it. Take a look around at the wealthiest people on the planet, for example. A quick Google check will tell you at least 80 to 90% of millionaires were self-made. No blood diamonds, no daddy's money. Supposedly. About 73% of billionaires were self-made, at least in America. No large inheritance. Fair enough, until we ask what the threshold for what a large inheritance is. Bezos, for example, had $300,000 from his parents. Bill Gates had help from his mother, and he attended an elite private school. Elon Musk grew up highly prosperous, and Zuckerberg caught a small loan for $100,000 from his father. As for Trump, well, all of us already know that story. So their inheritance wasn't massive, but larger than most Americans, and not including their social connections, education, race, class, and so on. And I don't think any of those amounts are too large for starter kits. But in a system that favors upward mobility without meager support horizontally, that is, to the workers, it's the laws that allow for late-stage development that become more problematic. People have a knee-jerk reaction to division. For example, we're married to the idea of united we stand, divided we fall. But is the United States actually standing? It really feels like we're all bent over instead. I'd rather take the fragmentation at this point because, well, the lube is drying out and P. Diddy hoarded all the baby oil. Anyway, a lower populated world where colonies are more independent has its own problems, just on a smaller scale. But at least by encouraging fractured states, there's an easy escape hatch from tyranny. And yes, different colonies will naturally develop their own governing logic, which should also lead to contention among different states. However, this problem is somewhat mediated in a future where education is prioritized and resource scarcity is a lesser factor with fewer people. There's fewer middlemen, technology focuses on the most difficult labor, and people have more time to focus on mutual aid, as well as personal growth, like music, gardening, repairing, movies, local sports, and animal care. So, the way that I see it is this. Labor would basically need to be divided into 4 categories. First, necessary work. This prevents suffering, and this is the top priority. Next is enabling work. These are the materials for culture, well-being, and the next layer of social glue. Then there's flourishing work. These aren't exactly productive jobs, but they enrich people's lives. And they aren't superfluous jobs either, so there's no manipulative advertisements or call center jobs spamming you with endless calls trying to sell you shit you clearly don't need. And then, of course, there is parasitic work, and that's where these jobs reside. Obviously, even with tens or hundreds of millions of people in a condensed world, you're going to harbor some parasites. It's unavoidable. Less is better. But with a focus on local communities, it's easier to weed these jobs out. From all of this, people would be more socially useful. We would need more broader skills, but it also means fewer people sit around in a cubicle all day, specialize on the same boring task, subjected to the same routine for most of their life. There's more novelty and transparency in the work. You're no longer the guy screwing on the same bolts with the same ratchet on the same desk over and over. You're an engineer as well as a repairman and an inventor. Or you're a teacher as well as an artist and a printer. Or maybe a carpenter as well as a designer. You're still a specialist, but your individuality tends to mirror your hybrid self because nobody's personality is the quality assurance analyst. What does that even mean? I don't even think they know what that means. No more assistant project managers. Their job has always been to get in the way and slow everyone else down without ever contributing. Of course, someone has to fill out the paperwork and check all the data, but we're just downsizing redundancy. There's far too much of that. We all know it. It only takes about 4 hours of honest work to take care of, not 40 hours a week, and I'm telling you from experience. And capitalism gives us more so long as we go to work. So you might say that people can be anything they want in their leisure time. Fair argument. The problem is that currently we have more access, more speed, more options, more debt, and more superficial lives. And that comes with more loneliness and less overall happiness. It's because you can't buy meaning, you have to actively and consistently create it. And when work takes up at least a third of our lifespan, then our job's define what our meaning is. So the work has to reflect who we are, which leaves us asking whether we're a hollow creature sitting in a cubicle all day, or a nurse working mad overtimes, only so she can afford rent when she's well past the point of caring about any of her patients, when clearly nobody gives a shit about her. You know, it's frightening how glaringly obvious the source of our problems are when we think about it for a few minutes. What's really depressing is that we all know this already, but all we seem to do is complain about it. Why am I even making a video about this, I wonder? That's the irony. There's not a whole lot I can offer in the fucked up world we live in, but when you overpopulate the planet with billions of people, there's nothing I can do about it. So back to the problem. There's too many people, too much competition, not enough resources, and too much exploitation. But I imagine one appears doubtful for such a seemingly radical change. And even if many people fragment into their own beliefs, education takes priority, and it's correlated with fewer children. Additionally, at some point we'll still face the dilemma of the scarcity of resources, so growth will be slower one way or another. Still, attenuationism isn't anti-progress. The opposite, really. We should implement better lab-grown meats, medical technology, wildlife contraception technology, and up-to-date manufacturing. All of that focuses on decentralization and the abolishment of mega corporations. I'm very anti-empire, which is probably unavoidable with 8 billion people. And if you wanted to take this idea further, you would downsize humanity and strategically place colonies in geographically sound areas. Places like Vietnam or Switzerland, for example. You'd still have some military, some drone deterrence, automatic defenses, and certain alliances. To be sure, it's not unlike the EU as it already stands, except on a smaller scale. If humanity has to function in some way to be the janitors on Earth, then something like a worldwide Scandinavia looks most optimal. A single attenuationist colony would get absolutely wrecked by an empire. It's true, I'll admit it. But a network of them would at least deter invasion, as well as totalitarianism. The federal military protects the umbrella, and the internal law protects their autonomy. Not perfect, but probably optimal. Attenuationism works best as a supporting structure within a large, pluralistic federation. And people need competition. So on the plus side, capitalism highly rewards ambition and innovation. But humanity needs an attitude change, so prestige aligns more with aesthetics, science, and ethics. This isn't delusional, though. I bet you haven't heard of Douyin, if I'm saying that correctly. While I'm not the biggest fan of China, they deserve a little praise. Douyin is the Chinese equivalent of Western TikTok, but instead of promoting selfish narcissists, fake news, AI slop, doom scrolling, and, well, vapid influencers who subsist completely on clout, their algorithm works differently. Even though it is an entertainment app, it promotes educational content like science and technology, even showcasing academic achievements, and it has state guidelines for younger users. But this isn't about America bad, China good. If you start digging through Douyin, there's a mountain of trash underneath, shitposting, trolling, endless e-commerce. The problem is that, like TikTok, it's damaging the human attention span. Once again, I'll just point out that in a world with fewer people, less engagement, and less likes, incentivizes people to interact in real-world scenarios. It's the same idea when a video game is a dead player count and you have no interest in playing it anymore, even if you can technically play it alone. Not always true, but a lack of social media engagement should provoke more people into touching grass. Doom scrolling will continue, and it'll grow worse, until you physically force people off. In a fragmented world with fewer people, I don't think that goes away altogether. That's impossible. But how could it be worse? Because if most of the world is already intimately connected online, but paradoxically we all feel so distant and so lonely, then isn't this due to the degradation of local communities? There's a lot of factors, but that has to be one of them. So, of course, Earth isn't ready for all of this yet, but assuming everyone becomes reasonably educated, dogmatic religion fades into oblivion, it does remain a possibility. And since it doesn't force people not to procreate, this becomes more of a question of time and education. And perhaps if a society flourished this way, people might have more children. The dilemma remains that nature tends to expand. But high intelligence also shows signs of self-destructiveness against nature, so the argument that we were meant to expand forever, it doesn't really bear out. And people with a better education tend to have fewer children, so attenuationism already appears as a developing possibility on its own. But it does face problems in regards to motivation, vibrant cultures, and hope for historical progress. There's a reason why Hegel was more popular than Schopenhauer back in his day. No one wants to be told they were born simply because their purpose was to keep a watch on wildlife suffering. It seems gloomy. But that also doesn't mean people can't craft personal meaning in an open, healthy world with plenty of liberty. And that's basically what we're doing already, except that religious people are telling their children that they were born on Earth so they can worship an invisible God forever. So, I'll take the accidental janitor turned full-time artist over that. It's up to an individual to decide how he or she will find meaning in their own life, regardless of their society's motivations. As for loneliness, the world is already a lonely place. Whether it's 8 billion people or 100 million people, this has more to do with a common objective and a shared understanding, rather than a population amount. The tribes least in touch with modern civilization claim to be generally happier and less lonely than we are, but we don't have to live lives exactly like them. We don't have to go backwards. We can bring that technology with us. When I think about this society, though, I do have my doubts, and I constantly ask myself if this is too idealistic. Maybe it is just psychological, and if I had the chance to join like-minded individuals in a trustworthy community without falling back into some country bumpkin lifestyle, I'd probably take that offer. But this would essentially require global change. So, in my ideal world, a bunch of city-states that look something like Switzerland collaborate together in a fair society. At least in my most ideal world. And while it doesn't hurt to discuss the future, I'm still skeptical. That's not even me being a pessimist, though. It's just realistic, unfortunately. And I don't know the political views of my audience. I assume it largely varies, maybe leftist, probably anti-authority, but there's no question we're in a post-capitalist nightmare in which oligarchs gamble with our lives, media churns out grotesque propaganda. A change is needed either way. This also makes me question whether I should give up on this country or keep trying to vote for the lesser of two evils. I do hate two-party system, but then again, I hate most systems. The accelerationists might cheer the process on, either to burn it all down or to watch their stocks go up. I want you all to consider whether we're actually accelerating towards anything, or if we're just spinning in circles. Same old story with brand new shiny toys attached. I wonder if we're accelerating backwards. But the problem doesn't end there. If the world reaches an apocalyptic stage where we plummet into civilizational collapse, humanity, they just won't suddenly forget how to stop having children. We're stubborn. That's how we're built. It's going to take a lot more than world wars and natural disasters. So, if humanity goes away, then the Earth will be inherited by the remaining species. And in that case, suffering may go on for hundreds of millions of years, or longer, which is an evolutionary nightmare. In this case, it's not enough to be quiet, and accelerationism could hasten this result. So that's why I believe in urgency for depopulation of peoples and animals. And this isn't about mass annihilation or hatred. Furthermore, at the current rate of resource expenditure, the way we're living is not sustainable. And a well-designed society would lower the need for living on the internet by making local communities more social, more aesthetic, and sufficient with materials. This would still be far from a utopia, but utopias don't exist in reality, certainly not for anything conscious. So before humanity burns itself alive, I believe the correct consideration is to carefully monitor all living systems. Even if that means using advanced technology, AI included, so that the fire can be kept under a watchful eye. Humanity could be nature's only solution to getting this done right for the rest of the planet. Otherwise, the first step would be a steady decline of human and animal population. How that's done exactly is another question, though at the current rate it seems to be more passively imminent than something that would demand any aggressive action. Some countries, again like Japan and South Korea, they're attenuating in their own way already, but the problem with them is that it's about a properly balanced age ratio. Younger people will carry a greater burden of supporting the older generation. Anyway, that's all I have to say for now, so let me know if you agree or disagree or something in between. I'm always welcome to changing my mind based on better arguments. I think the answer for what humanity faces over the coming generations, it'll require a delicate balance, and I do think that attenuationism, as I've stated it, is a step in the right direction. But for now, take care of yourselves, think about it a little bit, don't be stupid and don't be an asshole, and take care, have a good one. We'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.